Right. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, according to where you are. We are here with a seminar with Professor David Bacharach, who is Emeritus Professor at St. Cloud State University, Minnesota, also a former ski racer and a former coach. He has performed some very, very interesting research on nutrition, hydration, alpine skiing, and since it's very hard to find someone who knows the skiing and nutrition specifically related to skiing, we are delighted to have you virtually with us now and then in person in Alta Badia in more or less a month. David, off to you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen here in just a minute, but I want to let you know that we'll kind of divide this into several little pieces. Hopefully each one will be about 20 minutes or so, and then we can stop and ask questions and so on. And the first little piece will be physiology, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the research projects, and then more into the dietary pieces and perhaps some recommendations for future. So bear with me here while I share my screen. All right, everyone can see that, okay?
Yep.
All right, so my the topic really is these nutritional considerations for racers. And like I said, three particular pieces. First, the physiology. So we all have a basic understanding of what it takes in terms of energy demands in ski racing and so on, then some of the research studies, and then the dietary considerations. So if we look at this first part, we really have to pay attention to energy systems. And we know that the aerobic and the aerobic capacity parts are an important piece to that. And just to make sure I stay on time, I'm going to put my little timer on here. Okay, and off we go. So I don't want to get too long-winded. You know, as college professors tend to talk too much. So, but identifying kind of what we know from a physiology side, and then are there really any secrets that some people purport to suggest? Clearly, we've known for over 30 years that alpine ski racing requires a considerable amount of strength and power, and we need some endurance, and it needs to be in a balanced situation. If we look traditionally at textbooks and so on, we know that we have these three major energy systems that are with us. And if we're looking over on the left-hand side, you can see that the percent of energy contribution comes from each of those different systems, and the exercise duration on the x-axis there. If we look at really short duration things, we can see that the intermediate or immediate system, that ATP-CP system is in play, followed by durations of 30 seconds to maybe a minute or 2 minutes, which has traditionally been what alpine ski racing constitutes, and that's kind of that glycolytic pathways. And then if we look at long-term, the aerobic systems, we can see the yellow line that kind of diagonally sets across the time frames on the bottom. Unfortunately, I think people have sort of mistaken this theoretical basis to suggest that we really don't need an aerobic system within alpine ski racing because durations are so short. And it's clearly true that we need glycolytic pathways, but we'll explain a little bit more how that aerobic system kind of comes into play, and perhaps that immediate ATP-PC is not so important initially. With my younger athletes and even some of the other ones, I use sort of a campfire analogy, and some of you may have heard this before, perhaps not, but this is really good for younger kids and even parents to sort of understand. So we know that creatine phosphate, the CP, is kind of like paper. So if we want to start a fire, we can use that, but it certainly doesn't last very long. So if we put it into applications of ski racing, we know that maybe kicking out of the start or in a good push here, or if I get myself out of balance to get myself back into balance and quickly out of trouble, then I would use that creatine phosphate as an energy system. If I look at that anaerobic glycolytic piece, which is carbohydrates, that's kind of like kindling in a fire. And we know that we can start that fire with a paper, we can keep it kind of growing and building a little bit with kindling. It provides a good source, but it can't sustain that fire very long. But our goal from a training side of things or from a physiology piece is we really want to try and maximize that, but we want to spare it. And then we want to replenish it as often as we can. So hopefully you can keep those things in mind as we go. And then from the aerobic side, we know that fats are the major player in recovery and resting conditions, but aerobic can also use carbohydrates as fuel. Those are the logs. They're the long-term sources of that sustained flame. And logs can spare that kindling. So if I have an aerobic base and I have good, strong aerobic capacities, then I don't need to depend so much on those other two energy systems. But I can also consider those logs as options of splitting in to make more kindling, so I have that intermediate or the glycolytic pathways more available. Hopefully that makes sense to you. If I take that same concept and I not only add the timing piece, but I look at intensities, you can see that basically those three energy systems have flipped in the pattern. So under resting conditions, we can clearly see the aerobic system is really important to us. Under mild to moderate activities, that also is very important. And you can see glycolytic pathways, they start to ramp up as the intensity goes up. And then it's really not until those really high intensities that I would contribute a little bit of creatine phosphate. And in fact, the body tries to replenish that creatine phosphate as quickly as it's used, provided there's a mechanism for us to do that. And that primarily is that aerobic stuff. If I now go to the events in alpine ski racing, slalom, we look at that little box there, and that's typically between 45 to 60 seconds in duration. So they've kind of narrowed that band of energy systems. If I go to giant slalom, where now I've extended things to a minute and a half or so, you can see that that box gets a little bit bigger. And as it gets a little bit bigger, the contributions from the aerobic and from glycolytic pathways become larger. Same is true with Super G. We're 1 to 2 minutes in duration. Our box yet is getting a little bit bigger. And downhill up to 3 minutes perhaps, our box is once yet again larger. So in suggesting that I have more energy contribution coming from aerobic systems. So what does that really suggest to us? And in the past research, we've always thought that there's more aerobic demand for the longer the durations, but it isn't necessarily that simple. We need to have individual capacity assessments. We know that anaerobic pieces are certainly important, but we know that aerobic parts are also important. The idea of how those things complement one another is still a piece that's not so well understood. What we do know is that good skiers perform alike. So we now have to look at the functional capacity kind of thing, saying, all right, what is it that these energy systems need, and how do we provide that to them? So the first part is the delivery of nutrients, and primarily in our cases, these nutrients are oxygen and glucose. Then we also have to consider buffering or getting rid of the waste that we've generated from ATP or energy production. That's carbon dioxide, water, and in many cases, hydrogen protons. And those hydrogen protons are the ones that can change acid or the acid-base relationship within the cell, which can be problematic. Then restoring the energy systems, not only the creatine phosphate, but muscle glycogen and the glucose that's circulating in the liver glycogen, because we know that under those intense or moderate intense activities, we are going to use glucose as our fuel. And we can only store so much in the muscle, we can only store so much in the liver, so being able to provide it in a constant fashion is really important. If we look more specifically at the systems that are in sport, we certainly have the heart and the lungs, that's the cardiorespiratory side of things. And then we have the muscle fibers. We have a full range complement of muscle fibers. Clearly, we have slow twitch fibers, we have fast twitch fibers at the opposite end of the spectrum, and then we have these things in the middle called fast oxidative glycolytic fibers. And more recently in the literature, they talk to them about type 2X. Well, what's key about these particular fibers is the level of contribution they provide based on intensity of activity. In an a world-class sprinter or a world-class marathoner, you need to have specific numbers of those. But ski racers don't necessarily need to choose their parents so wisely, because we can get to the top levels of ski racing with a full spectrum of these different fiber types. We do, however, need to develop training goals that allow us to deliver oxygen and nutrients, as well as taking the muscle and enhance its ability to use not only the oxygen that's available, but energy substrates that come to the muscle. Training in many cases needs to go beyond sort of the basics. And if I look at strength and power, proprioception, I have to pay close attention to the recruitment pattern of muscle fibers. If I look at things that are relatively low intensity, you can see on this little graph that the yellow line accelerates quite quickly, and those are the slow twitch fibers. Because they're aerobic and they're very efficient and so on, our body will naturally try and recruit those muscle fibers as long as they can, produce the intensity that they can, because it's our advantage to do so. It's only when I start getting up to higher intensities of my maximum repetition force that I start recruiting some of those intermediate fibers, which are in blue, or those big fast twitch fibers that are in pink or purple there. As you see that they really don't start contributing until I get up to 80+% of my max effort. Now, I can create a scenario where I fatigue out some of the slow twitch fibers and I fatigue some of those intermediate type fibers, and I can start recruiting those fast twitch fibers. And in some cases, I want to create protocols allow me to do that. But I always have to think back to this general principle of size, but size also fits the idea of that's more aerobic, gradually going to more glycolytic. Strength and power has to be sports related. Legs and core are clearly key important things. And we know that we can train certain ways and it doesn't necessarily help us. So cross training can be good, but in every case, I need to have some kind of aerobic base that provides recovery for all those energy systems. I also need to do it in a balanced vibrational control with some visual constancy, some concentration, because we know that we're in a constantly changing environment when we're ski racing. So are there any secrets really to this training stuff? I don't think so. I know that people will talk about different elements. As long as I cover the basis from the physiological side, I pay attention to the energy systems, I don't ignore any component, then it comes down to things like the individual commitment, whether they're getting the diet, proper foods that they need in order to recover, as well as train, how much rest they get between training sessions, and then being able to manage stress. And managing stress, we'll talk a little bit about too, can come from physical stress as well as psychological stress. And I'm sure Jim Taylor maybe talked about that yesterday, hopefully, but all right. So, does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, Mike Moran, what is visual constancy?
Visual constancy is your ability to maintain a focus, even though a constantly changing environment. So maybe, let's see, the idea is that we're going fast, and what in ski racing in the literature is generally referred to coincident timing pieces. I have to know where I am, where the environment is, how things are changing, be able to adjust, and I need to be able to clearly see that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Mike.
No, yeah, it does.
No, the other proprioception is what?
Perception is how I interpret that information that's coming in. So
No, proprioception. Use the word.
proprioception, yes. Proprioception is your sensory information that's coming in. So whether that is body position, whether that's spatial awareness of where I am relative to my environment, making judgments about how I need to make changes in order to stay on course, for example, and so on. That involves getting some of that internal information that's identified as proprioception. So the external stuff was the visual, proprioception is the internal.
Yeah, sorry, for those following us online, please feel free to come in with questions. You can raise your hand and either write your questions in the box anonymously or with your name, or I can give you the voice here. Actually, I'm gonna allow Sophie to talk whenever she wants. Is our Greek member, but she's not physically with us, so I allowed her to speak whenever she wants without.
Sure.
Okay,
All right.
any other questions?
No, it was very comprehensive,
Hey,
very informative.
anyone from remote who wants to ask questions?
I'm assuming there's more information later.
Yeah. No, there's more information. Yeah. Okay, go.
All right. If no other questions, then we'll go on to this next little piece. I restart my timer once again so I don't go too long. All right, so this second piece is really a couple of the research studies that I engineered after talking with a variety of people and additionally asking kind of my own questions. And that one of the major pieces was how well do athletes actually control training stresses? And having worked with John Seifert and Ron Kipp and a few others on a few other projects with hydration and those kind of things, we were really curious also about what the actual metabolic demand of training. And what that means is that you have to go on the hill with portable systems and measure oxygen demand and energy consumption and so on. So me living in St. Cloud, Minnesota, said, okay, the best place probably to control as many conditions as possible is Mount Hood on the Palmer Glacier and Timberline Lodge in Oregon. That's quite a ways. For Europeans, that's about 3,000 kilometers, but that's a pretty short stint for us people who live in the US. Most athletes, they just fly to Portland, but research have a lot more stuff, so we had to go by truck. But Mount Hood is a really nice place. It's an active volcano, but up close, it's a really nice controlled environment, and that's really helpful to us. So we get there and we're recruiting athletes from a variety of different camps and so on. And I asked, well, what's the general recommendation you give to your athletes? And the traditional standard kind of case is eat a good breakfast, bring water, bring a snack. But nobody really knew how stressful their training is and so on. But we knew that that's the standard model. So we started out and just said, okay, well, let's see if we can influence training. And in this case, I show training impulse. Training impulse is nothing more than a perceived effort measure that's kind of subjective times the number of laps that the individuals skied each day. And we gave a group of 6 athletes a Camelback. And they wore it all day long and would just sip on it. And the other ones were given a water bottle or kept their own water bottle and encouraged to drink just like everybody else. And after just 3 days of skiing, their training impulses when the bottle was higher than it was with the Camelback. So wow, so that makes sense. If I have it readily available to me and I can just sip on it while I'm riding up the chair and recovery and those kind of things, that I'm probably a little bit better off. Well, we had also, John Seifert, Ron Kipp, and I had also done a little project with Excel gels and saying that, all right, if we add some extra carbohydrate to the training, does that change their efforts, or does that reduce them or improve the number of laps that they're able to do in a training session and so on? So we took a number.
David, sorry. Since you're not using slide, could you take the slides off so we can see your face?
Are my slides not?
No.
Oh, It says I'm sharing the screen. Let me
You're
see.
sharing the screen, but you're still sharing the old slides.
Your old slides. Oh, no, no, no. Okay, we got, let me, I'm sorry. Let's see if we can improve this. I'm going to close that one.
And we see you.
Yes, and now let's see if I can. Oh, I have to go back here. Oh, I lost you. Let's see. Here we go. All right. We'll try this. My apologies.
That's okay, don't worry. Oh, okay, here we are.
Now you have part two. Yes?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you, Fred, for all right. So we're back to this notion of the different studies, how well we control common stresses. And for this case, it was hydration and the metabolic demand. So we were going to do on snow measurements of energy costs and so on. Our project was out in Mount Hood. Like I said, athletes fly, we drive. Hood's that beautiful volcano that allows a nice controlled environment. Asking the coaches, what do they tell their athletes? Eat a good breakfast, bring water, bring a snack. But we still didn't really know. So now we get to where I think I was just explaining that we messed up a little bit. And with a camelback, when athletes are able to sip a little bit throughout the sequence of the race and riding the chair, their training efforts seem to be less. When we added a little bit of carbohydrate and carbohydrate gel, that also improved their perceived effort. But at this point, we still hadn't done anything with the other elements. So now we understood that at least hydration is in piece, carbohydrate can be important, preliminary. So now we get into, we had 14 subjects, ages 14 to 25, and you can see we had one 42-year-old, he was actually the father of one of the younger athletes, but he was a masters racer, a pretty good skier and those kind of things. And he was really eager to understand this whole process. So we allowed him to participate as well. So we had two subgroups. They skied with a metabolic system, the Oxycon Mobile, and we tried to determine energy demands. So you can see in the lower left, that's the particular unit itself. It's a little laptop computer. In the upper right is an athlete with gear on. And then through GS training, slalom training, free skiing, we measured what the metabolic demand was. In addition, at the same time, we had all the athletes eating at Huck's, and those of you familiar with Timberline know that pretty well. So we could keep track of what they ate. So we took digital pictures of everything that they ate before and after each meal so we could come up with calorie intake. Then extra calories were recorded as well. So the group that was on the hill, they were required to consume gels 5 to 6 per day based on body size. The control group were just encouraged to eat their snacks. So what we found was, from the metabolic side of things, from free skiing, slow to fast, it makes good sense. The oxygen consumption was not very high, only about 10 milliliters per kilogram of body mass. Fast free skiing was up to 20. For those of you that are not that familiar, resting metabolic values for oxygen are 3.5 ml. So we're on the order of 4 to 7 times, depending on speed. And it matches pretty nicely with average heart rate, somewhere around 110 to 140 for these particular training sessions. When we looked at GS training, you can see that the oxygen consumption was quite variable and it didn't get very high. That would be sort of in opposition to our general thinking if we looked at just energy systems, and that if that duration was out there around 90 seconds or even 60 seconds, that oxygen consumption should be higher. When we looked at slalom, even though slalom training was about the same, maybe even a touch longer, but not dramatic. The oxygen consumption was higher. Again, this is sort of in opposition to what we would theoretically think, saying that when the duration is shorter, oxygen consumption is not so great. But perhaps we have to pay closer attention to the notion of intensity and what's actually happening in the muscle, as opposed to just the duration of the event. When we look at one complete slalom pattern, this is actually, I think, relatively helpful in this understanding of where oxygen consumption comes in. If I look down there at the start, oxygen consumption goes up pretty quickly, and it peaks right at the end of the activity, and then it stays up and it gradually comes back down for another 30 or 40 seconds, down to where they're back on the chairlift, then drops back down to that 10 mils per kilogram, probably 3 times above resting values. And then it stays pretty low until they do their next lap on the course. Heart rate follows that same pattern, which is very nice because then I don't have to use a fancy metabolic system, but I can look potentially at heart rate as a key factor in terms of what the metabolic demand might be. And you can see that heart rate peaked just a little bit past the oxygen consumption, which is pretty typical, and heart rate in this case about 170. So when I compare the types of training, the GS training had the lowest VO2, fast free skiing was a little bit higher, and slalom was considerably higher, and that matches the heart rate patterns also. So we look at calorie requirements then and what their actual intake was. If we looked at the calories needed for skiing, the gel group and the control group were about the same, but we tried to match them up pretty well. So somewhere around 400 calories of skiing was needed. And if I look at their actual daily required calories, they were also pretty consistent, somewhere around 3,000, 3,200 calories. If I take those two then and I put them together, so I have the gel group plus the calories that they got on snow, they met what their daily calorie intake and daily needs were. The control group were about 500 calories below what they actually needed per day. And for those of you that are into statistics and so on, this was significantly different between the two groups. We also measured a little test for leg muscle fatigue, a 60% leg extension isometric time to fatigue. And after 6 days of training, the gel group was able to maintain their strength from the day one. The control group that didn't get the extra carbohydrate, they were about 5 seconds faster or fatiguing faster. And then after 2 weeks of training, same thing. So we know that the carbohydrate contributions, providing the hydration status was pretty consistent, was an important element. In the perceived side of things, no difference between the group that got the extra carbohydrate and the control group. But again, the leg extension task, the muscle soreness that the athletes experienced was greater in the control group compared to the gel group. Once again, it suggests not indicative or not a cause-effect piece, but it's suggestive that if I have some additional carbohydrate through my training, my muscles will feel better, and probably because I get less damage because they have to work with. So when we look at the bottom line, so slalom training for junior racers has a higher oxygen consumption than fast free skiing or GS, which is a little different than what we might have expected beforehand. Ad lib fluid and calorie intakes rarely enough to provide or prevent kind of the physical stress from multiple days of training. So we need to encourage people to drink, and we need to kind of force feed them some extra calories. total calorie intake and timing those calories should be an area of focus for, in this case, we were junior alpine ski racers. And I would think that that probably parallels older skiers too. Clearly, I have to acknowledge a couple people or a couple groups that helped Cardinal Health. They were the ones that provided the metabolic systems. Camelback gave Camelbacks to all the different athletes that participated. Pacific Health, they provided us all the gels. Timberline being able to use their space. Our oldest daughter, Kim, who was out there helping as a research assistant, and then Jose Lacasse and Tony Olin, who I was able to recruit a fairly large number of their athletes, and they were allowed to accommodate us, which was very nice. Okay, questions on this particular piece?
Okay, go ahead. And again, people from home, feel free to either ask questions in the Q&A using your name anonymously, or to raise your hand and I give you voice.
Hi, David. Joe from Stratton Mountain School.
Yes.
I'm familiar with your 2012 study. Question in regards to the gel. Did it include other nutrients such as electrolytes, amino acids, or any other vitamins as a part of that?
The gel that we used was Pacific's Health Excel gel, and it has a 4-to-1 carbohydrate to protein ratio. So there was some amino acids in there. There are no electrolytes really. And we didn't encourage anybody to add electrolytes to their fluid drinks. They just primarily drank water. But depending on the rate of sweat loss or fluid loss, that becomes another element of the discussion. We can talk a little bit more about that later, but even though we had the carbohydrate protein gel, I would feel pretty confident in saying that it doesn't really matter. It doesn't have to have that ratio. It can be carbohydrate only. And what's really nice about when I start exercising and I get more intense in terms of my activity, the type of carbohydrate is really not so critical. I can eat gummy bears or whatever, anything that fits my palate. If I'm not fond of the gels, I can choose something else.
Absolutely.
As long as I calculate approximate calories and come up with an estimate. So in our case, we were training 3 to 4 hours, and it's probably realistic to suggest that I need 100 calories of carbohydrate minimum every hour.
Okay, that's what I had thought. Also, what is your stance on, and I know maybe some of the research with beta-alanine and creatine monohydrate in relationship to some of the more stressful bouts of skiing, maybe in more advanced athletes. Have you seen or done any testing in relationship to those supplements?
I have not. I have a personal opinion, particularly about the creatine monohydrate, but I don't know, maybe we save that for a different time. But I'll clearly just say that I'm not a fan. Our body produces creatine, and we get creatine in our diet, provided we have good protein sources. And those couple grams are probably more than adequate. What I need to be able to have is a mechanism to be able to restore the creatine phosphate that I have available to me as quickly as possible, so that if I need it in the middle of a race or something like that, that I have it.
And beta-alanine.
Yeah, I'm not familiar enough really with beta-alanine to make a good comment here.
Thanks.
Anyway, you're talking about the gels, not the things that you put into the water.
Yeah, if we're talking about the carbohydrate, it's the gels. But once again, if you don't like gels, you can put the carbohydrate in the fluids as long as you consume it. The problem with putting the carbohydrate in fluid is you have to consume probably too much fluid to get the number of carbohydrates that you need. So if I do it in solid or in semi-solid gel form, it's a whole lot easier to get those calories in without upsetting the GI tract. Quite often, athletes don't particularly like to eat much when they're training. So getting them relatively high concentration of calorie content is gel is an easy way to do that.
David, Mike Moran here. Did you monitor how much sleep each one of these people got each night? And if that affected the caloric needs the next day?
Yeah, you know, I'm sure it does a little bit. We did not track specifically what their sleep was. We did ask them about the sleep quality. Some of the kids from lower elevations in the first week said that they did not sleep as well. But that was sort of across the board between the two groups. So it kind of a wash in terms of, even though we didn't measure it per se. But that would be something that's probably important to address, particularly with individual athletes and where they're coming from in terms of their training and so on.
So just to follow up, so things like cliff blocks, energy shoes, or what kind of thing you are talking about?
Yes. Say that again quickly.
The cliff block energy shoes, are what
Yeah,
the kind of things you're talking about.
Yes.
There's also these packets too that are more like a gel. That's more like a gummy bear.
Mhm.
These are more like a gel and they come in a little packet and you just like,
You give me the name if you don't
I
mind.
would.
All right, thank you.
Question, beside nutrition, what's your view on rest and recovery? Because I believe these camp situations are very demanding. Everyday skiing is actually way over ability of skiers, and the fact that every missed day is actually financial suicide. We are forced to ski every day, and in the end of the week, the curve of improvement goes drastically down.
Yes.
And it's just the fact that kids don't have any more proper coordination, support of the muscle system, and all of it. So, did you do any study on speed of recovery and after training, how fast can people get back to the previous level or
Sure.
above to compensate?
Unfortunately, I have not been involved in any of those studies, although I agree 100% with you that intensity of training right now is very high, and to go out and do that on a daily basis is extremely stressful. I'm not aware of research studies that have kind of tracked that, although I know there are some people that are kind of paying attention to it. And perhaps maybe in the last little piece that we talk about today from nutritional considerations, we can look at what Nana Meyer has done in her research, particularly with the athlete's plate, and how important dietary stuff is along with rest and recovery.
I think in that sense, training in a home environment when you can take the day off and anytime you want without suffering some financial consequences, it's far more favorable.
Yeah, there's no question about that. That's important, and I think there are. Again, they aren't research studies, but I know there's a few coaches that have adopted sort of a training impulse model. And training impulse model is the subjective evaluation of your training on that particular day, along with perhaps a short little test of heart rate recovery from a little step test or something of that nature. And if the athlete's not able to return to submaximal heart rate within a few minutes of this short little test, that they either take the day off or they have a free day. And I don't know if you, I have not been in touch with Ernie Rimmer for a number of years now. Some of you may know Ernie. He was a strength and conditioning coach at the Olympic Training Center in Salt Lake with the Alpine program. And he did a couple different specific tracking of individual athletes. And he modeled their training based on what their responses were to stresses, not only on the hill, but in dryland training and so on. So for some athletes, they weren't allowed to ski more than every other day. Whereas horses, like Lindsey Vaughn, for example, she could do it daily. But there were others that it's not possible.
That's what you're trying to.
Any questions from people online? Anyone here? Otherwise, we can get to your third session.
All right, so this is actually a little continuation of the things that we had just talked about with a few other little pieces. So we know that carbohydrate was important, but then how does that affect muscle fatigue? And that was the piece that we had yet to understand so much. So we went back to Hood, and you can see my slides again now.
Yes.
There you go. All right. So in this little study, we took 8 subjects. They were matched pairs by age and ability, randomly assigned to either that carbohydrate, protein, and control groups. The carbohydrate protein got those Excel gels, about 100 calories per those packages and so on. And the protocol then was over a 2-week period. We did baseline testing, then they did 3 days of GS training, then slalom training. They took a day off, baseline testing for that rest day between, 3 days GS, 3 days slalom. So again, like Richard was talking about, it's pretty stressful when you think of 6 straight days of training and how that might affect performance and so on. So in this first day, we took a fingerstick sample of creatine kinase. Creatine kinase is a marker indicative of sort of muscle damage. So we wanted to get a baseline measure, and then we did a little more specific with this maximal voluntary contraction of the leg test, time to fatigue. We also put surface electrodes on, so we wanted to see what was happening to the muscle itself. And then in the afternoons of day 4, 7, 8, 11, and 14, which is basically every third day, we did the same thing. We did the fingerstick for creatine kinase, and we did the maximum fatigue test along with the EMG measures. So this is what the time frame would look like. So the red is the CK, those are the blood samples. The green is the MVC test or the leg strength test. And we, again, water intake was controlled. We encouraged them, everybody had a Camelback, 1.5 or 1 to 1.5 liters while training. Other fluids were recorded throughout the day. Body weight was measured pre and post so that they were able to reestablish hydration status from day 1 to the next. Dietary intake again was monitored, but this time we paid a little closer attention to the format of their carbohydrates and proteins. Everybody ate at Huck's once again, same format as previous, pre and post pictures so we could identify the number of calories. Calories were also recorded while they were skiing. Carbohydrate group got those 4 to 6 gels per day, and the control group just encouraged to eat their snacks. So what we found was, again, from previous work, consistent once again, that the calories for skiing and the carbohydrate was somewhere around 400 to 450 calories for a training session. The calories needed, if I provided the extra gels, they would meet my calorie need. The control group that didn't get that extra calories Even though they were encouraged to eat, they didn't match. If I look at the general concentration of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, they were pretty consistent. There was no significant difference between them in terms of, so everybody ate pretty much similar in terms of sources of their calories. But the mean calorie intake versus the recommended daily allowance, clearly the carbohydrate protein gel group met their calorie needs, the control group did not. When I look at this time to fatigue of the muscle, leg muscle that is, you can see this gradual maintenance of the carbohydrate protein group, which is in yellow, and the gradual decline in the control group, which is in blue. There's that gradual decline. There was a difference between the end of that first week and the end of the second week of training. And what was interesting for us from the research side is when I looked at this EMG, which is the muscle activity, I can convert that into what's referred to as a power spectrum. The power spectrum basically takes that electrical signal and breaks it into little tiny components or frequencies. The higher frequencies are typically associated with fast twitch fibers. The lower frequencies, the more endurance type fibers, are associated with the slower or longer frequencies, right? So at 200 or 150 hertz, that would be cycles, right? Interesting is that when I look at the median frequency between the two groups, it doesn't appear to be much difference. They both will decline, not a big deal. We'd expected that. As those fast twitch fibers drop out of the fatiguing protocol, I go to the slow twitch fibers or the intermediate ones, and the frequencies, they get lower. When I look at the spectral shift, which is the actual change in the raw values, I can see that in this first 10 or 15 seconds, the carbohydrate control or carbohydrate protein group, their frequencies were a little bit higher, and the control groups dropped out pretty quickly. What that would suggest, and it's not direct once again, but it would suggest that perhaps the carbohydrate protein gels are providing additional fuel so that the faster twitch or the larger fibers are able to maintain force production a little bit longer. When I look at the creatine kinase changes, those are that blood marker, no differences. They go up, they go down. Again, suggesting that there's a fair amount of training stress on the muscle. And what that really tells us then is we need those extra calories, no question about that. Without those extra carbohydrate, I don't get it. So from the dietary intakes, inadequate if I only look at that in terms of what I feel I need. Carbohydrate calories and total calories should be an area of focus, as we said before. And the isometric knee extension test can show endurance reductions, but it may not be sense enough to monitor as stress. So was it Joe? I think you asked that question about training stresses, not only Mike, but yeah, Richard. But this was unfortunately not quite as strong as we would have liked to see. But this is sort of the notion that if I have some way to identify what the load is, then I can make a decision about whether I should ski the next day or not. Creatine kinase would have been one of those other markers that potentially would have said, yes, we can ski or not. Unfortunately, it didn't change the perception of training, and people were able to continue to train even though they had elevated creatine kinase levels. And as a side note, Ted Ligety happened to be there when we were doing this study, and he was asking lots of questions about this dietary stuff. And when I was taking pictures with everybody, and I said, well, can I take a picture of your plate? And he said, sure. So here's his plate with pancakes and a piece of toast with some peanut butter. The tradition is that we always have to have color on our plate. But maybe that was indicative of he liked the color gold. So he aspired to. All right. Same thanks to all the groups that helped with our little study and so on, and kind of further along a little bit the concept. So, all right, questions again.
And again, people following from remote are very much welcome to ask questions. Who want to go first? Chief, John?
No, straightforward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody?
No, there is lots of on the plate for us to
Yeah,
also
a lot.
chew over and go through it, because there is lots of research information we were not introduced to any time before. So it's actually very appealing and I think very beneficial, but we have to digest it a little bit.
Yeah, a lot of food for thought.
There's no question that it takes a lot to put all this stuff together. It makes me think back in 1996, I had an opportunity to attend the first International Congress Science of Skiing. It was organized by Erich Müller in Austria, Salzburger Group. And it was there that I met Nana Meyer, who was really extremely important to me as an advisor for these studies, because she is the registered dietitian. She gave me strong advice as well as strict requirements on how to count calories and do these measurements and so on. But it happened to be that I was talking with Nana and Philippe Chevalier, who was the former Swiss team coach. And Philippe said that he enjoyed this conference. However, he recognized and hoped that we as researchers also recognize that coaches and athletes often do trial and error experimentation to determine what works best. And then it's only a year or two later that research can document that that is in fact the case. Now we know that there are some things that we don't understand very well. And I think this particular piece on diet is one of those that we don't do a very good job, even with experimenting on our own. And we could do a little bit better with it if we have some of those kind of sound fundamentals or very basics to them. And I think that's kind of where we're hoping to go here in this last little piece.
I have a question, if you don't mind as well. I mean, one of the challenges of skiing in that discipline is that you have two runs, and often the two runs are a couple of hours apart. So there is the question of the management of that time. And you have to eat something, but that something can make you a break or kill you, right? And so I was wondering if you have advice, especially to the athletes that are following us online on, and I know it's individual. For instance, if I eat sweet, I'm dead. I mean, I won't wake up for the next 24 hours. I mean, always need to eat salt. So I know there is a part of personal metabolism there, but in general terms, if you have advice of do's and don'ts between runs.
I guess I would say start with training days and pretend and use them as a mock race day. So same routine, same foods, same drinks, same pattern, same timing. Everything has to be as if it was a race day. And then see how you respond to those. Some things that you'll feel comfortable eating and drinking. Other things you may try and say, no, I didn't like that, or it didn't make me feel good. I certainly don't want to do that. I don't want to try something new on a race day. I want to make sure that my body has the ability to absorb, control all the particular pieces, including kind of that stressful scenario of race day. So I have to make sure that I practice that before any serious race event. And we'll talk about a little bit more about that in terms of the timing of different foods or carbohydrates, that kind of stuff, as well as how I can deal with the autonomic nervous system's response to that stress, the classic fight or flight, and perhaps reducing the amount that I can absorb in the gut and those kind of things, because blood is being shunted elsewhere.
You have a part of this now.
Yep.
Oh, okay, awesome. So then it's a great way to introduce it then.
Okay, let's see. All right, so are we up with part 3, as it says?
The dietary considerations.
Yep, considerations. Okay. All right, so if we kind of recap what we really know, energy demands for alpine skiing are definitely high, and they include all energy pathways. Hydration status is clearly important. I need to be able to stay hydrated or to be euhydrated from the beginning to stave off any fatigue issues. Energy demands, alpine training are also high. In that 3-hour training session, typically 500 calories, or if we use the mantra of at least 100 calories of carbohydrate every hour of training, that's probably realistic. Supplemental carbohydrates during training can reduce the perceived effort. And I'm guessing that it also helps maintain muscle and minimizes muscle damage. If I look at guidelines now just for fluids, and these are kind of basic, simple things, in that before exercise, I want to make sure that I get somewhere between 350 or so 700 milliliters in the first or 2 to 4 hours before exercise. So that if we're thinking of a race day, I could model this also, saying that I want to get half a liter or so in the 2 to 4 hours. And I typically want to take small sips. The smaller the sips, the better, because I can easily absorb and it won't stress the GI system, even if I'm a little nervous about it. That's a good pattern. During exercise, if we're talking about training now, it's that 400 to 800 mils per hour. And some people will sweat a little bit more. They might need to up that a little bit. And if they don't, then it's probably okay. We cannot use thirst as a mechanism for hydration. We need to be proactive about that and constantly be thinking about adding a little extra fluid. If it's a training day after exercise, the ideal scenario is that you weigh yourself. For every kilogram of body weight you lost, you take in a liter of fluid, or for the Americans, about 500 mils or half a liter for every pound. Sports drinks with electrolytes and so on, they can be useful. And again, it really depends on sweat, and it also depends on diet. So if I have a reasonably well-balanced diet, then I'm probably going to get the electrolytes that I need. But if I'm training or in excess of 60 minutes and my sweat rate's relatively high, then sports drinks that contain electrolytes would be important to include rather than just water. So how do I stay hydrated? This is sort of an important piece. I want to drink small sips, just a mouthful, but do it often. So in the training science, and like every lap, every couple of times, and that I want small amounts. If they can be absorbed easily through the GI tract, particularly the large intestine, because that's what kind of controls our hydration, our total hydration levels. If I get a big bolus of fluid that goes into the large intestine, it will move quickly into the kidneys. The kidneys will filter it, dump it into the bladder, and then I need to urinate. If I add the stress of a race day or some other competition kind of pieces, I'm a little bit nervous. I get that little bit of adrenaline rush. And I also get kind of a stimulus to the bladder that makes me urged that I need to pee, even though I probably don't need to. But if I've combined that with a big gulp of water or two or something like that, then I definitely will have to void, and that's problematic. And we know that that's a problem for ski racers, has been for a long time. Speed suits obviously create an additional challenge and those kind of things. But afterwards, drink something. If I can get some carbohydrates in there afterwards, that's also good. And again, the standard of 1 liter for every kilogram of weight loss is really good to follow. So then the question is, how many calories do I actually need? There are a couple different equations that people have used and so on, and I encourage people to consider. The first one is the Cunningham. The Cunningham is quite accurate if I know the individual's body fat and their lean body mass. So if I had some measurement of body composition, and it shouldn't be just using measures of hydration, but actual reasonable measures for body composition. If I know my lean body mass, I can use a Cunningham. If I don't have that, I can use the Harris-Benedict, and that's been around for a long time. And there's a male and female equation, and you just put in individuals' weight, their height, and their age, and you can calculate pretty nicely what their recommended daily take is just for living. Now, there is no one-size-fits-all diet, but we have to pay attention to a couple different things when we look at diet, because it's influenced by genetics, metabolic factors, whether I might be diabetic. I mean, there's certainly some medical conditions that can be influenced, hormonal influences. They're also important, and then mood and stress. How I feel, whether I'm positive, whether I'm stressed, all those things can have an influence on how much I want to eat, as well as what my diet is like. There's a couple new terms that have come up, and they're really addressing this idea of underfueling. So rather than looking at just total calories, those kind of things, or the female triad about concerns, we have energy availability. And energy availability is really the amount of energy that's available to us after physical activity is accounted for each day. So that means the ability to restore stuff. My apologies, there's somebody outside. I don't know if you can hear that.
It's where he is. No, not here. It's not here.
Yeah.
It's in his house.
Okay.
Hold on just a second. I'm gonna see if I can stop this noise outside.
Oh, good.
It did.
I'm on a phone and I can hear you too loud. Thank you. Yeah? 10 minutes. 10 minutes? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Oh my apologies. We have somebody working out on the lawn right outside, so it was very noisy. All right, so energy availability. I need to be able to have extra calories at the end of my training day, and that's really needed to repair tissue that's damaged. And we know that we always have a little bit of tissue damage anytime we do any kind of activity. And then the relative energy deficiency in sport, which is now identified as REDS, replaces that female triad, because any athlete can be susceptible to an energy deficiency. It's not just females. Females perhaps are more susceptible, but it can also happen to males. So we kind of generically put those two together. So the International Olympic Committee has set guidelines for this energy availability. So if I have adequate energy availability, that means that I've got about 45 calories per kilogram of fat-free mass. Again, I need to know somebody's body composition to come up with a reasonable value, but if you think that the average athlete is probably somewhere between 10 and 15% body fat, and you can just assume that, then for males, then probably 15 to 22% for females, you can make that little adjustment. But low energy availability is less than 30 calories per kilogram of fat-free mass. And if I'm low in my energy availability, that can lead to the deficiency. So I need to be able to screen for that. So how do I screen for that? I got to have some measure of dietary intake. So I need to have an approximation, or need to have athletes kind of keep track of their calories, not all the time, but occasionally saying, all right, give me an estimate of what your calories are. And based on that, you can come up with whether or not they're in a susceptibility for energy or low energy availability. And then if that's the case, then we say we need to add some additional calories to their diet. This is where Nana Meyer has made things a little bit simpler. She has created the athlete's plate. This is a registered element that she has done, and it's broken it down into kind of three different intensity ranges based on individual and so on. So if I look at easy training, or if I'm trying to manage weight, if I'm moderate intensity, if I'm hard training, and let's look at these a little more closely. If I'm just doing easy training, maintenance, recovery type stuff, or weight management, you see in the lower left, about 25% of our calories should be protein. If I'm weight management, you can see that I have just a slight more protein, and what I'm reducing is my carbohydrates. She refers to them as whole grains, but they fit pasta, rice, cereals, all those things, breads and so on. And if I'm controlling weight or I'm doing easy training, I don't really need that extra carbohydrate. Because that low intensity activity, fuel for activity is primarily fat. And I don't need that carbohydrate in there. And if I'm trying to control for weight, so on, then the carbohydrate also is a piece that I don't necessarily need. Fruits and vegetables, they take up 50%. Then you can see there's some added little pieces on each side and so on. It's quite nice in terms of how I might be able to put together what my total calories look like. When I increase to more moderate training, you can see that, again, the protein over in the lower left is still only 25% of my total calories. But now what's increased is the carbohydrate source, and what's decreased a little bit are the vegetable side of things. So now I'm about 3/5 for carbohydrates and for vegetables, and still 25% or a quarter is protein sources. When I get to higher intensity or game day, so okay, this is kind of addressing a little bit the notions of, if it's a race day, I want to make sure that I'm optimal. And sorry for the resolution isn't quite as good on this, so it's not you, I just didn't have a good picture. But you can see now that the carbohydrate source is 50% of my calories, where protein remains at 25%. Vegetables are a little bit lower, they're at 25% as well. The question is, how do I get those into my diet and making it comfortable for me to do so? That's kind of an element that we can look at and saying, all right, if I look at my carbohydrate requirements, if it's light intensity activity to moderate to very high, I can see I have a range anywhere from 200 all the way up to 800 grams of carbohydrate. The targets are somewhere in that 3 to 5 kilogram range for light activity, 8 to 12 for very high. We know that we need to get those calories. Here's the timing side of things, and this is generally for exercise that's in longer than 60 minutes, but it also fits very nicely for shorter duration exercise that can be done in appropriate timing. So let me qualify that a little bit. If I look at the time before exercise, if I'm 4 hours before my exercise session, that might be longer, or it could be that high intensity race day. My goal is to try to get somewhere around 280 grams or 4 grams per kilogram body weight. And how I do that is personal preference, but it needs to be carbohydrates that are easily digestible. And if I'm 4 hours beforehand, it is not going to have an impact on insulin response or blood glucose or any of those things that sometimes people are concerned about, saying, well, I don't want to end up in a low blood glucose level, hypoglycemic condition, where I get a response that happens quite quickly. So now if I work down this little chart, and if I'm only 2 hours away, then I have to make sure that I reduce my total calorie intake, because I don't want anything really in the gut that is going to provide any uncomfortable feeling for me prior to my exercise. And if it's an hour, okay, 70 grams. But again, that's pretty easy to accomplish in a variety of different ways. So I don't need to have large quantities and so on, but I could certainly have a little snack, even an hour ahead, or granola bar or something like that. Easily done for athletes if they follow a pattern and they're used to it. Protein intake stuff, generally it's not problematic. Nana Meyer has suggested that most athletes get adequate protein. We don't need to have additional. There are some concerns for people that follow vegetarian guidelines or are strict vegans. And in those cases, they need to have some additional protein because some of their protein sources are a little bit harder to digest. So making sure that I've got a little bit more available to me guarantees that they will actually get to where they need to go. Now, factors that affect individuals' appetite, certainly health status. If I'm not feeling well, obviously we lose our appetite. If I haven't slept well, I typically don't like to eat. Food choices, this is a particular one that of interest, particularly if athletes are traveling. If they don't have access to their preferred foods or their comfort foods I would kind of define as ones that they're accustomed to eating, they like, they enjoy, they know that they get a normal response from. If I'm in a different country and I don't have it available to me, that's a problem. So then I have to make decisions about, do I provide that, bring it along, make it available so that I have it, so that I'm not forced to choose something else. That's a decision that the individual athletes have to make. Or I need to broaden the individual's horizons so that they're comfortable eating different foods, so that when they get in those situations, they have some alternative choices to make. The last one I've included in here is the stress piece. And stress is clearly an element that athletes, particularly on race days, need to pay attention to, because it does affect how the body absorbs or digests both liquids and solids. And I need to be able to get those calories in beforehand. So I cannot just be uncomfortable and say, I'm not going to eat, I'll wait until after. I have to create a protocol that allows me to take in some calories prior to the major event. Macronutrients that are important: iron, vitamin D, calcium, B12 and zinc, antioxidant vitamins A, C, and E, electrolytes. Those are all important, but the typical diet and so on generally provides adequate amounts for each of these different pieces. There are some elements, if you look at the third column, there are concerns. Iron increases at altitude. That's a problem. Females, also a potential problem. Again, is it noise too?
Yep, I think you need to
Hold on.
tell them something.
Yep.
I'm gonna.
Partners. Are we back?
Yep.
Okay, very good. All right. So if we look at this third column, the ones of concern, that's the piece that we might pay attention to. If I have a normal diet and I don't have any other issues, generally getting these micronutrients and so on is not problematic. But females potentially have a requirement for more iron. There could be scenarios in a vegan's diet where calcium, zinc, and B12 are not available to the quantities that are needed, primarily because those come from most meat proteins and dairy products and so on. But there are some alternatives, and supplements could be an option under certain conditions, but it's really dependent more so on if I have a relatively strict diet as opposed to one that's typical or more variable. Again, on their electrolytes, the sodium, potassium, and so on, typically when I get those in foods, if I eat fruits and vegetables and I take a little extra, if I sweat a lot, then I'm in good shape there. It's not too much of an issue. There are three particular reputable groups. NSF, which stands for the National Sanitation Foundation. They were some of the first ones that made sure that there weren't bacteria and things in supplements, or the gold standard of the banned substance control group, or informed choice. If you see those labels on supplements, if you're using supplements or people are considering supplements, then you can feel pretty confident that those elements will be provided in what they suggest they are. If you don't see those, then I would be suspect of them, and I would want to make sure that I didn't ingest any supplement that might put the athlete at risk for any particular banned substance or in competition and so on. So look for those three if you can. Nana Meyer, you may know, or Michaela Meixner, they're both registered dietitians. Michaela actually was an author of the book that's coming out pretty soon. I'll share that information with you shortly. And I had the good fortune of being able to work with her on that particular chapter. And certainly Nana Meyer. If any of you have an interest in contacting either one of these, I'll be happy to share your information with them and ask whether they would be willing to visit with you or contact you. They're both very receptive and wonderful individuals, so I appreciate their assistance in me learning more about diets and so on. The book that I just talked about is entitled Science of Alpine Ski Racing.
Okay, I think you need to stop it.
Okay, so the Science of Alpine Ski Racing, that's Jimmy Pritchard and Jim Taylor, and Jim may have talked about that already, but here's a link, and I think I sent all this stuff to Fed too, that you can share that.
I will.
Interesting. So that's all I have, and thank you, and I'm happy to answer questions.
And again, people following online, you're welcome to ask questions. Either in the Q&A, or raise your hand, or Sophia Ford. Now, two things. On the 4 hours, that little thing for skiing has some difficulty because the 4 hours before the first run will typically be way into the night. And we don't have 4 hours between the two runs. So between inspections and everything, we have maybe between 1 and 1 hour in good managed races, 2 hours in badly managed ones. So that limit. And the question of any suggestion there. And then the other thing, I mean, practical suggestions to kids.
Yeah.
Everything and the count of everything being eaten between runs. So you gave us all the formulas, but maybe more practical suggestions to the kids.
Yep, absolutely. Yep.
And then the other thing, I saw that in each of those 3 schemes, you always had cafe. So what is your take between the use of coffee and training, and especially on racing day?
All right, so from a dietary standpoint, first in terms of what I want to do 24 hours before the race, I want to go into a pattern where I can maximize my diet to make sure that I've got good carbohydrate stores. So within 24 hours prior to the race, if I can guarantee that I get good carbohydrate intake, I will maximize my muscle glycogen. So that's step one. 24 hours ahead of time, I want to make sure that I don't have real intense training and those kind of things, and I get good carbohydrate in my meals. Then if it's a early morning race and so on, morning, if I'm a caffeine user, no problem. Drink some caffeine. It's a central nervous stimulant. It stimulates free fatty acid, so that's a good thing. An energy source, that kind of stuff. If I'm not a caffeine user, then I need to stay away from it because caffeine is a diuretic, and even a small amount of caffeine for a non-caffeine user will stimulate their bladder. They'll start to pee, and if they combine that with a little exercise stress, or pre-race stress, then that's a problem where I might end up being dehydrated before I even start. Small amounts of carbohydrate that are easily digestible, and they can come in pretty much any form. It could be granola, it could be muesli, it could be a bar, it could be a gel, and that 1 to 2 hours prior, I just want to have small amounts that I can digest pretty easily, and I can nibble on the next piece, the next little piece, so just to make sure that I've sort of topped off the tank. And the same thing with fluids, little sips, make sure that I have it with me all the way up to the time that I start. Let's see, what else was, between runs, immediately after, again, with exercise intensity pretty high and those kind of things, it doesn't matter what type of carbohydrate I ingest because I'm not going to create an insulin response, simply because the cells are very sensitive to glucose uptake. So a little bit of carbohydrate immediately after the run would be helpful. So a little glucose in the water, hydration or whatever, gummy bears, whatever individual likes, they enjoy. And again, they need to have practiced this before the actual event. So in training and so on. If they get that, pretty easy. A few hours, also not problematic, but again, they should be carbohydrates that are easily digestible. And if there's a combination of carbohydrate protein, also not a problem, provided the quantities aren't too high that is going to create an uncomfortable feeling for the athlete.
Other questions? People from home, don't be shy. Okay. Anyone?
No?
That's a lot of food for thought. A lot of learning. So no paninis with hamburgers or what's his word? So what do they give at the, come on, Stefan, at the no speck, but also no, they give it there oh God, this loaf, a little loaf. Sausages, I take it. No panini with sausages between runs, correct?
If I'm accustomed to eating that and it doesn't upset me, it's not a problem. If I have 2 to 4 hours between, it's not a problem. I'll digest it and I'll clear it from the gut and it won't be problematic. If I only have a short time, if I have an hour and a half, that's not good.
Okay. Anyone else? Questions? I will distribute the slides that you sent me so that you have them. Anybody else? Appreciate it. All right, and then, so thank you so much. We look forward to seeing you in Alta Badia, drive you more. We will drive before that, it's gonna be 1 month, more or less, from now. Thank you so much for taking the time, and we look forward to seeing you home.
Yes, it was an absolute honor for me and enjoyable. So it's a topic I like very much. And
It's super interesting. Super interesting. I'm thankful to Jim for recommending you, because it's hard to find nutritionists who actually know what ski is about and what ski demand. Because normally it's more for, marathons, which clearly is not our sport. All right, thank you, and see you soon in Italy. Thank you again.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
David.